The hum is the first thing you forget about. Then it's the last thing you remember. A constant low-frequency drone that vibrates up through the floor, through the worn-out seat cushion, and settles deep in your bones. It's the song of the Cummins diesel, the soundtrack to my life for the past 22 years. My name is Ray, and my world is a 10x8 cabin on 18 wheels. Tonight, that world was crossing the Nevada desert under a moonless sky. U.S. Route 95. They call it the loneliest road in America, but that's a different highway. Truth is, out here, they're all the loneliest road. Just a two-lane ribbon of asphalt cutting through an ocean of sagebrush and shadows. To my left and right, nothing but darkness for 100 miles. The kind of profound, absolute black that makes you feel like you're driving through a tunnel drilled into the fabric of the universe. The only things that were real were the twin beams of my headlights, the glowing green dials on my dash, and the lukewarm coffee in the cup holder. I was hauling a load of industrial piping from Reno to Vegas, an easy run. All I had to do was keep the needle at 65 and my eyes open. It happened around 2:13 a.m., according to the dashboard clock. My eyes were getting heavy, the hypnosis of the road setting in. I was thinking about breakfast in Tonopah when I saw them, not ahead of me, but high up to the west. Lights. Now, you see lights all the time out here. Planes on their way to Vegas or LAX, satellites crawling patiently across the star field, but these weren't planes. They were three brilliant emerald green points of light. They weren't blinking, they weren't moving in a straight line, they were just hanging there, silent, arranged in a perfect rigid triangle. Too low for satellites, too high and too still for helicopters. I'd heard the stories from other drivers. The late-night talk radio hosts that kept us company on these long hauls were full of them. Tales of strange craft over military bases, of silent triangular ships that defied physics. I always dismissed them as tall tales, products at too much caffeine and not enough sleep. But seeing it with your own eyes changes things. The hair on my arm stood up. I eased my foot off the accelerator, the truck slowing with a sigh of air brakes. I watched, mesmerized, as the lights held their formation for maybe 30 seconds. Then they did something that broke my brain. They didn't accelerate away. They just vanished, all three at once. One moment they were there, burning holes in the darkness, and the next, gone. As if someone had flipped a switch. I was about to write it off, to convince myself I'd imagined it, when one of them came back. A single point of green light, reappearing in the same spot. It flickered, pulsed once, twice, and then it started to fall. It wasn't like a meteor, a fiery streak burning through the atmosphere. It was more like a wounded bird, tumbling end over end, the green light sputtering, dimming, then flaring up again. It fell silently, disappearing behind a low ridge about a mile off the highway. There was no sound, no explosion, no plume of smoke. Just nothing. I sat there, my truck idling on the shoulder, the engine's rumble suddenly feeling very loud in the immense silence. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to put the truck in gear and get the hell out of there. Call it in on the CB maybe, or better yet, forget I ever saw it. Just keep driving, deliver the pipes, get paid. But I couldn't. 22 years of staring at empty roads, and for the first time, something had happened. Something impossible. I killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. I grabbed the big mag light from the door pocket, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had to know. I just had to know. I opened the door, and the dry, cold desert air hit me. The smell of dust and sagebrush. I stepped down from the cab, my boots crunching on the gravel, and started walking towards that ridge, into the deep, waiting darkness. The distance from the road to the ridge couldn't have been more than a mile.
But out here, distances lie. The air so clear and the landscape so vast and empty that everything looks closer than it really is. The first 100 yards were easy, just the gravel and dust to the shoulder. Then the real desert began. My heavy work boots sank into the soft, loose sand, and every step became a conscious effort. The familiar rumble of my truck faded behind me, swallowed by a silence so complete it felt like a physical pressure against my eardrums. All I could hear was the rasp of my own breathing and the frantic jackhammer rhythm of my heart. The beam of my maglite cut a clean white cone through the oppressive dark. It danced over sagebrush that looked like skeletal hands reaching up from the ground and rocks that took on the shapes of sleeping animals in the flickering light. I felt exposed, a solitary figure moving through an alien world. The sky above was an explosion of stars, more than I'd ever seen from the light-polluted highways. It was beautiful, but tonight it felt menacing. It was no longer a familiar, comforting canopy. It was a vast, deep ocean from which things could fall. Halfway to the ridge, I stopped, sweeping the beam of the light around me. Nothing, just the wind, a low, mournful whisper that snaked through the brush. The pragmatist in me, the trucker who dealt with blown tires, engine trouble, and highway patrolmen for 2 decades, was screaming that this was insane. I was chasing a hallucination, a trick of the tired mind. I should be back in my cab, making up for lost time. But the memory of those lights, silent, impossible, and intelligent in their movement, pushed me forward. I had to see. I had to touch the proof. As I got closer to the ridge, a smell hit my nose. It wasn't the smell of fire or fuel. It was clean, sterile, the smell of ozone, like the air after a violent lightning strike, but without the scent of rain. It was a dead electric smell that made the fillings in my teeth ache. I crested the low ridge, my breath catching in my throat. The ground sloped down into a shallow basin, maybe 50 feet across. In the center of it, my flashlight beam revealed something wrong. It wasn't a crater. There was no displaced earth, no sign of a violent impact. It was a patch of sand, a near-perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter that had been changed. It looked dark and slick, as if the sand had been melted into black, uneven glass and then instantly cooled. It glittered under my light, a diseased-looking patch on the desert floor. I walked down into the basin, my boots making no sound on the fused sand. The air here was noticeably colder, a pocket of deep chill that had no right to exist in the desert. The ozone smell was stronger, sharp and biting. And there, in the exact center of the glassy circle, was the source. It was small, no bigger than my fist, and half buried in the black sand. It wasn't a jagged piece of shrapnel. It was smooth, dark, and featureless, like a river stone worn down by 1,000,000 years of current. But its shape was subtly wrong. It had the soft curves of something organic, but they were interrupted by angles so sharp and precise they had to be artificial. It seemed to drink the light from my flashlight, reflecting almost nothing back. It was the darkest thing I'd ever seen. I crouched down, the beam trembling in my hand. As the light moved over its surface, I saw them. Faint patterns like circuitry that pulsed with a soft, internal, iridescent light. They weren't etched on the surface. They looked like they were deep inside, shifting and reconfiguring in complex geometric dances. It was like watching a city-map of a completely alien world drawn in liquid light, constantly evolving. My hand reached out, then hesitated. A primal fear, a warning from the deepest part of my brain told me not to touch it. But the curiosity was a physical force, an itch I had to scratch. I pulled off my leather work glove, wanting to feel it with my bare skin. I pressed my fingertips against it. The cold was instantaneous and shocking. It wasn't the simple cold of a rock on a chilly night. This was an active, hungry cold that felt like it was pulling the life force right out of my hand. It was unnervingly smooth, like polished obsidian, yet it didn't feel solid. It felt like it was vibrating at a frequency I couldn't hear but could feel in my teeth. I snatched my hand back, my fingers numb and tingling. I stared at it for a long minute, my mind racing. This was it. This was the proof. It was real. I couldn't leave it here. If I did, someone else would find it. Men in suits, probably, the kind of men that made problems and witnesses disappear. Or worse, maybe no one would find it at all, and it would just lie here, a silent testament to a secret that I would then have to carry alone, forever wondering if I'd dreamed it. Acting on pure instinct, I pulled a greasy rag from my back pocket, the one I used for checking the oil, and carefully worked it under the object. It was heavier than it looked, dense and solid. I lifted it, wrapped the rag around it several times, creating a barrier between its impossible surface and the world I knew. The walk back to the truck was different. The silence was no longer empty, it was watchful. The darkness was no longer passive, it was hiding things. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. Every rustle of a bush sounded like a whisper. I was no longer an observer. I had crossed a line. I had stolen a piece of the impossible, and I had the terrifying feeling that its owners would want it back. I scrambled back into the cab, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. The familiar smell of stale coffee and worn vinyl was a comfort, but it was a fragile one. The cab felt different now, contaminated by the presence of the thing I carried. I locked the door, a completely useless gesture, I knew, but it made me feel a fraction safer. I lifted the mattress on my sleeper bunk and stowed the rag-wrapped object in the toolbox underneath, alongside my wrenches and tire iron. For a moment, I just sat in the driver's seat, shaken. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, its familiar rumble a defiant shout in the face of the silent watching desert. I checked my mirrors, flicked on my headlights, and slowly, carefully, pulled my rig back onto the empty highway. I had to get moving. I had to put miles between me and that place. I glanced in my driver's side mirror one last time, checking the dark stretch of road behind me, and my blood ran cold. Headlights. 2 of them. Far back in the distance, maybe 2 miles. They weren't on the highway itself. They were turning onto the highway, kicking up a small cloud of dust from a dirt access road that wasn't on any map, a road that emerged from the direction of the ridge. They hadn't been there before I stopped, and now they were there, and they were coming my way.
For the first few minutes, I told myself it was nothing. Just a rancher heading home late, or maybe some prospector coming back from a claim. Out here, you might go an hour without seeing another soul, but eventually someone always shows up. It was a coincidence. It had to be. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, focusing on the hypnotic rhythm of the yellow lines disappearing under my truck. I tried to regulate my breathing, to push down the cold knot of fear tightening in my gut. But I couldn't ignore them. Every 15 seconds, my eyes would dart back to the mirror. The headlights were still there. 2 perfect, brilliant white circles burning in the darkness. They weren't getting closer, but they weren't falling behind either. They were a fixed point in my mirror, a ghost haunting my wake.
I decided to run a little test, a simple one. My speedometer read 65 miles per hour, dead on. I gently pressed the accelerator, the engine's deep rumble rising in pitch as the needle climbed to 70. For a few moments, the distance between us seemed to grow. The lights in the mirror got slightly smaller. I felt a wave of relief. See, just a regular driver. But the relief was short-lived. The headlights stabilized, then began to grow brighter, larger. They were matching my speed. They settled back into the same position as before, an unwavering presence. My heart sank. Okay, no coincidence. I eased my foot off the pedal, letting the truck's momentum carry me as the speed dropped back to 65, then down to 60. I watched the mirror. For a moment, they gained on me, the lights growing brighter, more intense. Then they too slowed, falling back until they were at the exact same following distance as before. It was like they were connected to me by an invisible, solid rod. This was no rancher. This was a predator, pacing its prey, and I was the prey. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead, trickling down my temples despite the chill from the air conditioner blasting in the cab. My hands felt slick on the hard plastic of the steering wheel. My mind was a whirlwind of panic. Who were they? How did they find me so fast? Did the object have a tracker? Was it broadcasting a signal? I thought of it lying cold and silent in my toolbox, wrapped in a filthy rag. It felt like I had a radioactive isotope under my bed, a single piece of a secret so massive that these people, whoever they were, had been dispatched into the empty heart of the night to retrieve it. My first instinct was to grab the CB radio, to shout out for help, to tell someone, anyone, what was happening. But what would I say? My call sign was Long Rider, but tonight I felt like Crazy Man. Breaker 19, this is Long Rider. Yeah, I'm being followed on US 95 by some spooks because I picked up a piece of a flying saucer. I could already hear the laughter, followed by the clicks of them switching to another channel. And if I called the cops, what then? By the time a highway patrol car reached me out here, it could be an hour. An hour was an eternity I didn't think I had. And what if the people behind me were the authorities? A kind of authority that doesn't use flashing red and blue lights. No, I was alone. Utterly and completely alone. The vast, empty desert that had always been a symbol of freedom to me now felt like a cage. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The headlights behind me grew brighter. They were closing the distance now, done with the game of pacing me. From a mile back to half a mile, then a quarter mile. The glare was so intense I had to flip my mirror to the night setting. They were in a car, low to the ground. Its shape was still an indistinct, dark mass behind the blinding lights. A black sedan, maybe. The kind you see in movies, right before something bad happens. Then they flashed their high beams. Not once, like a signal to let me pass, but twice. A sharp, deliberate double flash. It wasn't a request. It was a command. Pull over. My blood turned to ice. This was it, the moment of confrontation. I could pull over and face them, or I could run. But you can't outrun a car in an 18-wheeler. You can only outthink them, or outbrute them. My eyes scanned the darkness ahead, beyond the reach of my headlights. I knew this stretch of road. I'd driven it 100 times. Most drivers just saw endless sagebrush, but I knew its secrets. About 5 miles ahead, on the right, there was a turnoff. It wasn't marked. It was an old, washed-out service road for a power line maintenance crew, and it probably hadn't been used in years. It was a straight shot into the hills, rough and unpredictable. A stupid, reckless risk for a rig my size. The chances of getting stuck or blowing a tire were high, but it was the only chance I had. The sedan was closer now, maybe just a few hundred yards back. I could feel their impatience. Any second now, they would make a move, try to overtake me and force me off the road. I had to act first. My plan formed in a split second of adrenaline-fueled clarity. I reached down and flicked off my running lights, then my headlights. For a terrifying moment, I was completely blind, plunging my truck and the entire world into absolute blackness. I was counting in my head, relying on muscle memory and the feel of the road. 1, 2, 3. On 3, I yanked the wheel hard to the right. The truck groaned in protest, the load of pipes shifting with a deafening crash. The tires screamed as they left the smooth asphalt and bit into the loose gravel and dirt of the shoulder. I was thrown against the door, my shoulders screaming in pain. The cab bucked and jolted violently as we careened off the highway and into the rugged, unseen service road of the desert. I slammed the headlight switch back on, and the beams illuminated a nightmare of ruts and rocks and thorny bushes directly in my path. I held on to the wheel for dear life, the truck roaring and swaying like a wounded beast, plunging deeper into the hostile, unforgiving darkness of the desert. In the split second before I made the turn, I glanced one last time in the mirror. I saw the black sedan, its lights on high beam, continue straight down the highway, momentarily confused by my sudden disappearance. But I knew they would see the cloud of dust. They would see the tracks. They wouldn't be fooled for long. I hadn't lost them. I had just changed the hunting ground.
The world outside my windshield became a violent, lurching nightmare. The service road wasn't just rough, it was a suggestion of a road, a half-forgotten scar on the land. My headlights, bouncing frantically, illuminated a treacherous path of deep, tire-swallowing ruts and rocks the size of fists that shot out from under my wheels like cannonballs. The cab of my truck, my home, was transformed into a torture chamber. I was thrown left and right, my seatbelt the only thing keeping me from cracking my head on the window. Every jolt sent a shockwave up my spine. Behind me, in the trailer, the 6-ton load of steel pipes was a symphony of destruction, crashing and booming with every bump, a sound so loud I was sure they could hear it all the way back on the highway. My knuckles were bone white, my grip on the steering wheel so tight I felt like I could crush it into dust. I was wrestling with a 40-ton beast, forcing it down a path it was never meant to travel, and it fought me every inch of the way. The engine screamed in a low gear, a sound of pure mechanical agony. Twice the trailer fishtailed wildly, and I had to wrestle it back into line, my heart seizing in my chest. A jackknife out here wouldn't just mean the end of my run, it would mean the end of everything. But the adrenaline was a fire in my veins. It sharpened my senses, narrowed my world down to the 20-foot patch of hell, illuminated by my lights. I had one goal: get over the next rise, break the line of sight, disappear. After what felt like an eternity of this brutal, bone-jarring punishment, the ground began to level out. The road dipped down into a small basin surrounded by a cluster of colossal rock formations, weathered into monstrous shapes that looked like sleeping giants. It was a pocket of deeper darkness, a natural hiding place. It was now or never. I slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a halt with a final groaning shudder. I immediately killed the engine and switched off the lights. The sudden plunge and absolute silence and blackness was disorienting. The crashing symphony of the pipes was replaced by the frantic thumping of my own heart. The only other sounds were the frantic ticking of the superheated engine, cooling in the cold night air, and my own ragged, desperate gasps for breath. I stayed perfectly still, listening. Slowly, my eyes adjusted. The faint starlight painted the landscape in shades of gray and black. I risked a peek over the dashboard, looking back in the direction of the highway. For a long, terrifying minute, there was nothing, just the empty, dark desert. A spark of hope ignited in my chest. Did it work? Did I actually lose them? Then I saw it, the distant glow. The headlights of the sedan had stopped at the turnoff. They sat there, unmoving, their beams pointed down the service road I had just taken, a silent, patient predator sniffing the trail. They knew I was out here. They were just deciding on the best way to come and get me. I watched, frozen, as the car's headlights began to sweep back and forth, methodically scanning the darkness. They were powerful beams, far stronger than stock headlights.
They cut through the night, illuminating clouds of dust and casting long, dancing shadows from the rocks. The beams drew closer, sweeping across the face of the rock formation directly in front of me. I ducked below the window, my body rigid, convinced the light would slice through the cab and pin me in its glare. The light passed over, and the darkness returned. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. One of the car doors opened. I couldn't see the vehicle itself, just the light it cast. A single figure stepped out, silhouetted against the blinding headlights. It was tall and impossibly thin, a stick figure drawn in black against the brilliant white. The figure stood motionless for a moment, and then it raised a device to its eyes. It wasn't binoculars. It was a long cylindrical object that didn't reflect the light. It swept the device across the landscape, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. They weren't just looking, they were scanning. I understood then. My desperate plan had only bought me minutes. I had traded the highway for a dead-end trap. The truck was a 40-ton steel coffin. It was loud, it left a trail a mile wide, and it was a massive, unmissable target for whatever high-tech gadget that thin man was holding. I couldn't stay here. My only advantage was the darkness and the complex rocky terrain. I had to go on foot. The decision was agony. My truck wasn't just a machine, it was my entire life. Everything I owned, everything I was tied up in that rig. Leaving it felt like cutting off a limb. But the choice was simple, my life or the truck's. I moved with a speed I didn't know I possessed. I scrambled into the sleeper cab, my hands finding my worn denim go bag in the dark. It had a change of clothes, some water, beef jerky, a first aid kit, survival basics. Then I lifted the mattress, my fingers fumbling for the toolbox. I retrieved the rag-wrapped object. It was still cold, the unnatural chill seeping even through the thick cloth. It felt like a block of frozen dread in my hand. I stuffed it deep in the bag, zipped it up, and slung it over my shoulder. I took a last look around the dark, familiar cab, the faint smell of coffee, the worn spot on the driver's seat, the picture of my daughter, faded from the sun, taped to the dash. It was a lifetime of memories, a lifetime that was now over. Ignoring the driver's side, which faced the open desert, I crawled over the center console and quietly pushed open the passenger door. It opened with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. I slipped out, closing it gently behind me until it latched. I was on the ground, exposed. The cold desert air felt electric on my skin. I crouched low, using the bulk of my truck as cover, and began to scramble up the nearest rock-strewn hill, away from the sweeping lights, away from the road, away from everything I had ever known. I was no longer a trucker. I was a fugitive, and the hunt was just begun.
The climb was hell. Every survival show I'd ever half-watched while waiting for a load talked about staying calm, conserving energy. That was easy for them to say. They weren't being hunted. Pure animal panic was a fuel of its own, and it drove me up the steep, rocky incline. My steel-toed work boots, so practical in the cab and on the loading dock, were clumsy lead weights on the treacherous terrain. Loose scree shifted under my feet, sending small avalanches of pebbles clattering down into the darkness behind me. Each sound was a cannon shot in the silence, and I would freeze, my back drenched in sweat, listening for any answering noise from below. My lungs burned. I was a smoker, a man whose most strenuous exercise was climbing into his cab. The thin, high desert air felt like razor blades in my throat. The go bag, which had seemed so light just minutes ago, now felt like it was filled with lead bricks, its straps digging cruelly into my shoulders. Inside it, I could feel the hard, dense shape of the object, a constant cold reminder of why I was doing this. My hands were raw and bleeding, scraped open by the sharp granite rock I used to pull myself upwards. After a grueling 20 minutes, I reached a narrow ledge near the crest of the ridge. I collapsed behind a slab of rock, my chest heaving, my body screaming in protest. I needed to rest, but more than that, I needed to see. I needed to know what my hunters were doing. Carefully, I crawled to the edge and peered down into the basin.
The sight below stole the air from my already starved lungs. The black sedan had navigated the rough service road with an eerie ease and was now parked beside my rig. In the faint starlight, the contrast was absurd. My Kenworth was a titan, a monument of steel and chrome, and the sedan was a sleek black scalpel parked next to it. Its lights were off, and it seemed to blend into the shadows. Two figures emerged from the car. Even from this distance, probably close to a mile, they were just as I remembered, unnaturally tall and slender. They moved with a liquid grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. There was no wasted motion. It wasn't human. Humans stumble in the dark. They move with hesitation. These things flowed. They didn't use flashlights. They didn't need them. They walked with a chilling confidence, their dark forms moving through the night as if it were broad daylight. They split up. One went to the front of my truck, the other to the passenger side. The one at the passenger door didn't try the handle, it simply opened. I knew for a fact I had locked it. My heart hammered against my ribs. I watched as the figure leaned into the cab. It didn't rummage around, it didn't search. It moved directly to the sleeper section, and I knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that it was reaching under the bunk, right where the toolbox was, right where the object had been. After a few seconds, the figure straightened up and stepped back from my truck, empty-handed. The two of them met again in the space between the vehicles. They stood perfectly still for a moment, two black spires in the starlight. I imagined they were communicating, though I saw no gestures, heard no sounds. They knew the object was gone. They knew I had taken it. And then the moment that will be burned into my memory until the day I die. One of the figures, the one that had been in my truck, slowly turned its head. It scanned the Burke landscape, past my abandoned rig, past the service road, and then it lifted its gaze. It looked up the rocky hillside, past the dark formations and shadowy canyons, and its head stopped, locking onto exactly the spot where I was hiding. It was impossible. I was a mile away, a tiny shape in a field of a million other shapes, cloaked in near total darkness. There were no lights, no sounds, no human eyes could have seen me. But I felt its gaze on me as surely as if it was a physical touch, a cold, piercing pressure in my mind. It knew. Panic, stark and absolute, seized me. I scrambled back from the ledge, crab-walking over the sharp rocks, my mind screaming a single repeating word, run. They could see in the dark. They could track the object. They weren't government agents. They weren't men in black. They were something else entirely, something alien. The owners. I got to my feet and began to run, stumbling and sliding down the other side of the ridge, plunging deeper into the untamed wilderness. I wasn't thinking about a destination anymore. My only plan was to put distance, terrain, anything I could between me and those things. My trucker's instincts, the part of my brain used to navigating the vast, faceless interstate system, took over. I found the North Star, a familiar, distant friend, and used it to keep a general western heading, pushing myself into the heart of the Great Basin. For hours, I moved through a brutal, otherworldly landscape. I scrambled down canyons with walls that seemed to suck the starlight from the sky, and I crossed wide, flat plains of cracked earth that crunched under my boots. The world was a maze of black and gray, and I was the terrified rat running through it. The object in my bag felt heavier with every step, no longer just a piece of evidence, but a homing beacon I was foolishly carrying. I thought about throwing it, dropping it down a crevice, but I couldn't. It felt too important. And I knew they were hunting me now, not just the object. I was a witness. I was exhausted, dehydrated, and running on pure terror. Just as I felt my legs were about to give out, as I stumbled through a narrow wash, I felt something strange. My first instinct was to recoil, to scramble away from the bag as if a snake were coiled inside. The glowing, pulsing object was no longer just a piece of strange debris. It was active. It was alive. The rhythmic hum vibrated up through the soles of my boots,
a deep, resonant frequency that felt ancient and powerful. The soft green light pulsed with the steady, calm cadence of a sleeping breath, casting long, dancing shadows on the canyon walls around me. I stared at it, mesmerized and terrified in equal measure. My mind, already stretched to its breaking point, struggled to process what I was seeing. The object hadn't been damaged in the fall. It had been dormant, a hibernating creature. And my proximity, or maybe the sheer isolation of this place, had awakened it. Was it a beacon? Was it calling to its owners, broadcasting my exact location? Or was it doing something else? My fear was a cold, hard knot in my stomach, but another feeling was bubbling up alongside it, a desperate, burning curiosity. I had risked everything for this thing. I had abandoned my life, my livelihood, and was now a fugitive in a desert that wanted me dead. I deserved to know what it was. With a trembling hand, I reached into the bag and slowly, carefully, began to unwrap the greasy rag. The cloth fell away, and for the first time I saw the object unobscured. The internal light was brighter now, a soft emerald luminescence that seemed to be contained just beneath its impossibly smooth black surface. The intricate shifting patterns I had seen earlier were now moving with a clear purpose, flowing like rivers of light across its surface in complex, mesmerizing pathways. It was breathtakingly beautiful. I held my hand over it. The profound cold was still there, but it no longer felt aggressive or life-draining. It was just a deep, static cold, like the air in a cave deep underground. The vibration was stronger, a tangible thrumming against my palm. As I watched, a new pattern began to emerge in the flowing light. It coalesced in the center of the object, the swirling lines of light slowing and arranging themselves into a familiar shape. It was a star map, not a human map with its straight lines and familiar constellations, but it was undeniably a map. There were clusters of light that looked like galaxies and brighter points that had to be suns. Thin, glowing lines connected some of them, forming pathways, routes, and in one corner of the map, a single, tiny, blue-green spark blinked rhythmically. That spark was surrounded by other points of light, a small, familiar cluster, the Sun, Mars, Jupiter. It was our solar system. The pulsing light wasn't a distress call, it was a navigation chart, a cosmic GPS. This wasn't just a piece of ship, it was the ship's heart, its brain. I was so engrossed in this impossible revelation that I didn't hear them until it was almost too late. It wasn't a sound that alerted me, but a change in the environment, a sudden unnatural drop in the ambient temperature. The faint whisper of the desert wind died, and a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the canyon. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I looked up from the glowing object, my eyes scanning the top of the canyon walls above me. And I saw them. They were on opposite sides of the wash, two impossibly tall, thin silhouettes standing against the star-dusted sky. They weren't panting or scrambling like I had been. They stood perfectly still like obsidian statues, their presence radiating a palpable aura of menace. They had tracked me, not by following my clumsy footprints, but by some other, more efficient means. They had simply appeared as if they had stepped out of the shadows themselves. A wave of pure, unreasoning terror washed over me. I threw the object back into the bag, zipped it shut, and scrambled to my feet. There was no way to go back. My only path was forward, deeper into the winding, narrow wash. I started to run again, my exhausted legs screaming in protest, my boots kicking up clouds of sand. Behind me, there was no sound of pursuit, no footsteps, no shouting, but I knew they were coming. The oppressive silence that followed me was more terrifying than any noise. I risked a glance over my shoulder. What I saw defied the laws of physics. They weren't running. They were descending the sheer canyon walls as if gravity were a suggestion they had chosen to ignore. They moved with a slow, deliberate, spider-like grace, their long limbs finding impossible holds on the vertical rock face. They didn't fall. They flowed downwards,
their movements economical and utterly silent. They were in no hurry. They knew I couldn't escape. That sight broke the last of my resolve. My mind fractured, overwhelmed by the sheer alien wrongness of it all. I ran blindly, my breath sobbing in my chest, tears of terror and exhaustion streaming down my face. The canyon twisted and turned, a claustrophobic tunnel of rock and sand. I rounded a sharp bend, and my feet hit something soft. I stumbled, falling hard, my face hitting the sand. I pushed myself up, spitting out grit, my body a constellation of new aches and pains. I had tripped over something. I looked back and saw the weathered, bleached-out skeleton of a long-dead coyote. But that wasn't what had stopped me in my tracks. It was what lay beyond it. The wash ended here, not in a gentle slope, but in a sheer, vertical drop, a dead end. I crawled to the edge and looked down. It was a drop of at least 100 feet into a rocky, shadow-choked basin below. There was no way down. I was trapped. I scrambled back from the edge, my back hitting the cold, hard rock of the canyon wall. I was cornered. I looked back the way I came, my eyes wide with terror. I could hear something now, a faint, dry scraping sound. The sound of their limbs on the rock as they rounded the final bend, closing in for the kill. I clutched the go bag to my chest, the strange pulsing object within it, my only companion at the end of the world. There was nowhere left to run.
The dry, scraping sound grew louder, echoing off the narrow canyon walls. It was the sound of insects, of desert predators, of things that belonged to the night. And then they rounded the final bend. They stepped into the small, dead-end space with me, and the world seemed to shrink. They were taller than I'd thought, at least 7, maybe 8 feet tall. Their slender frames outlined against the faint starlight. Their long limbs moved with that same unnerving liquid grace, but now that they were close, I could see more. They wore no clothes, but their skin was like polished, dark chitin, reflecting the starlight with a dull and metallic sheen. They had no discernible faces. The space between their high, narrow shoulders was a smooth, featureless plain that seemed to ripple and shift as if I were looking at a heat haze. It was a face that my human brain refused to properly see. They stopped about 20 feet away, standing side by side, perfectly still. They didn't breathe, they didn't blink, they just existed, their presence a crushing weight in the small space. Their heads, if you could call them that, tilted in perfect unison, a gesture of cold, analytical curiosity. They were looking at the prey they had successfully cornered. The last dregs of my adrenaline turned from fuel for flight into fuel for a fight I couldn't win. I was an animal trapped in a cage, and all that was left was to bare my teeth. I scrambled backward until my back hit the cold, solid rock of the cliff face. I clutched the go bag to my chest like a shield. "Stay back!" The words tore from my raw throat, a pathetic, useless shout that sounded small and frail in the oppressive silence. "What do you want from me?" The figures didn't react to my voice. They took a single, synchronized step forward, then another. The dry scraping sound was the sound of their feet on the sandy ground. They weren't going to kill me quickly, they were savoring it. And then everything changed. The object in my bag, which had been pulsing with a soft, gentle light, suddenly flared. It wasn't a gradual brightening, it was instantaneous. A brilliant emerald inferno of light exploded from my bag, so intense that it shone through the thick canvas as if it were paper. The low, humming vibration rose in pitch and volume, becoming a single, pure, resonant tone that filled the canyon. It was a sound of immense, ancient power, a chord that vibrated not in my ears but in the very marrow of my bones. The two figures stopped dead. Their fluid movements became rigid, locked in place. Their featureless heads snapped down, their attention entirely fixed on the source of the light and sound in my hands. Their posture, once predatory and confident, now seemed uncertain.
wary. The light intensified, and my mind was suddenly flooded. It wasn't a thought or a voice, it was a torrent of pure information, a data stream of raw feeling and imagery that bypassed my senses entirely. I saw what the object saw, the silent, terrifying beauty of the void between galaxies. I felt the eons-long journey through cold, empty space. I saw nebulae explode in silent, slow-motion ballets of color. I felt the purpose of the object. It wasn't just a map, it was a seed, a library, a key. It carried the genetic and cultural blueprint of a civilization far older than humanity. It was a feel-safe, sent out to preserve a legacy. And I, Raymond Keeler, a 48-year-old trucker from Bakersfield, had picked it up. By touching it, by taking it, I had become its steward, its keeper. Through the flood of cosmic data, I felt one other thing, a clear, distinct pulse of information directed at the two creatures in front of me. It was a command, a designation. It was the object telling its hunters that I was now under its protection, that I was part of the system. The two figures physically recoiled. They took a clumsy step backward, their smooth grace gone, replaced with a jerky, spastic movement. The light and the sound pouring from the bag seemed to cause them physical pain. Their featureless faces shimmered and distorted violently. They were guards, hunters, retrievers. They were designed to track and secure the dormant object, but they were not meant to interface with it, and they certainly weren't meant to defy it. In that moment, through the haze of alien information flooding my brain, a single crazy human thought cut through. They were afraid of it. My terror was still there, a cold, hard stone in my stomach, but now it had a companion, a wild, desperate sliver of hope. I was still trapped, I was still at a dead end, but I wasn't defenseless. I was holding the one thing in the universe they could not touch. Slowly, my trembling legs finding a strength I didn't know they had, I pushed myself off the canyon wall. I got to my feet, holding the brilliantly glowing bag out in front of me with both hands. It was no longer a bag of supplies. It was a lantern, a ward, a scepter. The emerald light washed over the canyon, banishing the shadows and painting the chitinous skin of the creatures in a sickly green light. I took a breath, and then I took a step forward, towards them. They retreated, another jerky, panicked step backward. Their fluid menace was completely shattered, replaced by what I could only interpret as fear. I took another step, then another. I wasn't running, I was walking, a slow, deliberate death march in reverse. I kept my eyes on them, my arms outstretched, presenting the glowing heart of their own technology to them like a holy cross to a vampire. I walked right up to the point where they had stood, and then I walked between them. For a terrifying second, I was so close I could have reached out and touched their strange, shifting skin. They shrank away from me, from the light, their tall forms cringing, their bodies contorted to give me as much space as possible. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the path ahead, on the winding canyon that had been my trap and was now my only way out. I walked past them. I didn't run. I didn't look back. I just kept walking, one heavy, clumsy boot in front of the other, my heart hammering a rhythm that was a mix of pure terror and ecstatic, unbelievable triumph.
The walk back down the canyon was the longest of my life. I didn't dare run. I forced myself into a steady, deliberate pace, my eyes fixed forward, my arms locked as I held the glowing bag out in front of me. The brilliant emerald light served as my beacon, illuminating the treacherous path. The sound, that pure, resonant tone, was a constant shield around me, a declaration of my new, impossible status. I didn't look back, but I could feel them. They were following. Not with the silent, predatory grace of before, but hesitantly, keeping a fixed, respectful distance. They were no longer hunters. They were an escort, or guards. I was no longer their quarry. I was their responsibility, a problem they had to contain. The dynamic had shifted in a way that I still couldn't comprehend.
When I finally emerged from the mouth of the wash, back into the open basin where my truck stood like a steel mausoleum, the sight was surreal. The black sedan was still there, a sliver of void next to my familiar Kenworth. The two figures emerged from the canyon behind me and stopped, once again becoming silent, motionless statues at the edge of the darkness. They would come no further. The light from the object in my bag began to subside. The intense, blinding glare softened, returning to the gentle, rhythmic pulse from before. The all-encompassing tone faded back into a low, bone-deep hum. The immediate danger had passed, but the tension in the air was thick enough to taste. I stood there for a long time, my body shaking with the aftershocks of adrenaline and terror. I was alive. I was free. But I was stranded in the middle of the Nevada desert, miles from any civilization, with a piece of alien technology that had just declared me its keeper, and two non-human entities watching my every move. The life of Ray Keeler, trucker, was definitively over. The question was, what came next? My truck. It was my only hope. If I could get it started, if the brutal trip down the service road hadn't wrecked it beyond repair, I could put some real distance between myself and this place. I approached the cab with a new sense of caution. My sanctuary had been violated. I half expected the door to be locked again, or for some alien trap to be waiting inside. But the door swung open easily at my touch. Inside, everything was as I had left it, except for a subtle wrongness. The air was thick with that same sterile ozone smell I'd noticed at the crash site. I ran my hand over the dashboard, the seat, the steering wheel. A fine, almost invisible layer of black, metallic dust coated everything. It was like they had forensically scanned the entire cab, atom by atom. I put the go bag on the passenger seat. The object inside gave a soft, steady pulse, its green light a strangely comforting presence now. It felt like a companion. I slid into the driver's seat, the worn vinyl a familiar comfort. My hands found the keys still in the ignition. I took a deep breath, offered a silent prayer to whatever deity might be listening to a man in my situation, and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed once, twice, and then roared to life with a defiant rumble that echoed through the basin. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. A wave of profound relief washed over me, so potent it almost made me weep. I wasn't stranded. I had a chance. I didn't waste a second. I threw the truck into gear, my hands flying across the controls with practiced ease. With a groan of tortured metal, I swung the rig around, its headlights cutting a swath through the darkness, illuminating the two silent figures who still stood, unmoving, watching me. I didn't wait to see what they would do. I floored it. The journey back up the service road was just as brutal as the journey down, but this time it was fueled by a desperate hope instead of a desperate fear. The truck rattled and screamed, but it held together. When my tires finally hit the smooth, solid asphalt of the highway, it felt like I was docking a ship after a storm-tossed voyage at sea. I turned east, away from the lonely stretches of central Nevada and towards the distant, hazy glow of civilization, towards Vegas. It was the last place they'd expect me to go. A fugitive isn't supposed to run towards the brightest lights. But I needed people. I needed crowds to get lost in. I needed a place where two unnaturally tall, thin figures would stand out. As I drove, my mind raced, trying to piece together the torrent of information the object had poured into my brain. It wasn't a weapon. It was a vessel, a lifeboat. The civilization that built it was ancient, peaceful, and, I felt with a profound sense of sadness, gone. They had foreseen their end and had sent out thousands of these seeds, these libraries across the galaxy. They weren't meant to be found by anyone. They were meant to drift, to wait, to preserve the memory of a people long turned to dust.
This one had been knocked off its eons-long trajectory, perhaps by a meteor, and had fallen into Earth's gravity well. And the hunters, they weren't the creators. They were janitors. A different species, or perhaps a bioengineered tool, tasked with retrieving any of the seeds that went astray. Their job was to maintain the silence, to put the toys back in the box, to ensure the great silent quarantine of space was not broken by a lost piece of technology falling into the wrong hands, my hands. I glanced at the bag on the passenger seat. The green light pulsed softly. I had broken the rules of the universe. I had picked up a message in a bottle that had been floating in the cosmic ocean for 1,000,000 years, and now I was inextricably linked to it. The object, the seed, had designated me as its new vessel, its protector. It couldn't fulfill its final purpose, to find a new barren world and begin the slow process of seeding life, but it could survive, and its survival was now tied to mine. I was no longer just a man running for his life. I was a fugitive librarian, a guardian of a dead civilization, hauling the most precious cargo in the universe in the cab of a beat-up Kenworth. And I had no idea what to do next.
Driving into Las Vegas after a night in the primeval darkness of the desert was like surfacing from the deep ocean directly into the heart of a fireworks factory explosion. For dozens of miles, the horizon had been a sick orange smear. It grew steadily brighter as I drove, swallowing the stars one by one, until it became a vast dome of light that promised noise, chaos, and, most importantly, anonymity. It was exactly what I needed. I hit the outskirts of the city as the sun was rising, a pale disk fighting a losing battle against the neon that had not yet surrendered to the day. The streets were already teeming with the nocturnal and the diurnal crossing paths. Casino workers heading home from the graveyard shift, their faces pale and drawn, and tourists who hadn't been to bed yet, their eyes wide with a mixture of exhaustion and adrenaline. To them, it was just another morning in Sin City. To me, it was landfall on an alien planet. My first and most immediate problem was the truck. My Kenworth, my home, my only real asset, was now the single biggest liability in the world. In the desert, its size was a comfort. Here, it was a moving billboard advertising my presence. It had license plates, a VIN number, a company logo on the door. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and grime from its off-road excursion. And it was hauling a trailer full of industrial pipes that were, by now, officially late for delivery, which meant someone, somewhere, would eventually start looking for them. For me. I needed to disappear, and you can't disappear in a 40-ton truck. I avoided the glittering artery of the Strip, navigating my rig through the city's less glamorous back streets. I passed warehouses covered in graffiti, empty lots filled with tumbleweeds, and rows of pawn shops with iron bars on the windows. I finally found what I was looking for, a dilapidated, independent truck stop on the industrial edge of North Las Vegas, the kind of place where drivers paid in cash and no one asked any questions. I pulled the rig into a far, dark corner of the lot, next to a rusted-out trailer that looked like it hadn't moved since the Carter administration, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was different from the silence of the desert. It was filled with the low hum of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of unseen traffic. I sat in the cab, the go bag on the seat beside me, and tried to think. The hunters, the janitors, whatever they were, they hadn't followed me. I'd been checking my mirrors compulsively the whole way, and the road behind me had remained empty. But I knew it wasn't over. They had failed to retrieve the object through direct confrontation. Their methods would have to change. They would become smarter. What if they used our own systems against me? What if they made an anonymous call, reporting my truck as stolen or abandoned? The local police or highway patrol would find it in hours. My name, my photo, my entire life was tied to this truck's registration. They could put my face on every news channel in the state.
They could turn the very society I was trying to hide in into their own personal dragnet. The two silent, alien figures were terrifying, but the thought of 1,000 uniformed cops hunting me was a new kind of dread. I had to sever the connection. I had to become a ghost. I took the last of the cash I had on me, about $400, and made my move. I walked across the street to a 24-hour convenience store that smelled of stale hot dogs and disinfectant. I bought a cheap burner phone, a plain black backpack, a pair of jeans, a gray hoodie, a baseball cap, and as much bottled water and beef jerky as I could carry. Back in the cab, I changed out of my trucker's clothes. Looking at the reflection in the side mirror, I saw a stranger. The familiar face was there, but the context was gone. I was no longer Ray Keeler, trucker. I was just some tired, middle-aged guy in a hoodie. Exactly what I wanted to be. I packed the new backpack with my supplies in the go bag, the object now hidden at the very bottom. Then came the hardest part. I took the keys to the Kenworth, the keys I'd had on my belt for 15 years, and laid them on the dashboard. I took one last look around the cab at the worn seat, the coffee stains, the faded photo of my daughter. It was a goodbye to my entire world. I opened the door, stepped out, and closed it gently behind me. I didn't look back, I just started walking, melting into the grimy, sun-drenched streets of the city. An hour later, I was in a cheap motel room a few blocks off the strip. The air conditioner rattled, the carpet was stained, and the window looked out onto a brick wall, but it was a locked room. It was sanctuary. I dumped the backpack on the lumpy bed and finally took the object out. In the dim, curtained light of the room, it seemed less alien. The green glow was soft, the hum barely perceptible. I sat on the edge of the bed and placed it on my lap. I needed guidance. I needed to know what to do next. I closed my eyes, put my hand on its cool, smooth surface, and just focused. I thought about my fear, my confusion, and asked the silent cosmic library a simple question. Now, what? The surface of the object grew warmer under my touch. The patterns of light inside began to shift, faster and faster. The star map that I had seen before appeared, a swirling galaxy of light. The tiny, pulsing blue-green dot that I was, here in this motel room, still blinked steadily. I watched, mesmerized as the map zoomed in, the galaxies fading away, replaced by a familiar continent, North America. Then, something new happened. On the other side of the country, in a mountainous region in the eastern United States, another point of light began to pulse. It was a faint white light, and its rhythm was erratic, weak, like a flickering candle. It wasn't a star. It was another location on the ground. And I understood, with a sudden, shocking clarity. The cosmic bottle that I had picked up wasn't the only one that had washed ashore. There was another seed, another lost piece of the same ancient legacy had fallen here on Earth, and it was in trouble. It was dying. The object in my hands wasn't just telling me to run. It was giving me a destination. It was giving me a purpose.
The new light on the object's map pulsed with a frail, desperate rhythm. It was a cry for help, a silent, ancient plea carried across the continent. My own fear, the immediate terror of being hunted, suddenly felt insignificant. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about something far bigger, something that stretched beyond my understanding of time and space. I was no longer just a trucker who stumbled onto a secret. I was a reluctant messenger, a guardian. The coordinates for this new signal, though not precise, clearly pointed to the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in West Virginia or eastern Kentucky, a wilderness far different from the Nevada desert, but equally unforgiving. Deep forests, winding rivers, remote hollows, a place where things could get lost for centuries. Or in this case, a place where another seed was dying. My new mission was clear. I had to get there. But how? I was a fugitive, My truck was likely already being investigated. My face, my name were probably flagged. I had no money beyond the few $100s from my old life, and that wouldn't last long. I couldn't fly. Airports were surveillance hubs. Buses or trains were too risky. Too many checkpoints. Too many eyes. There was only one way. The hardest way. The oldest way. I had to hitchhike. It was insane. An unwashed, middle-aged man with a haunted look in his eyes, carrying a backpack that held the key to cosmic secrets, trying to cross a continent on the kindness of strangers. But I had no other choice. I spent the next few days preparing. I stayed in the cheap motel, conserving my money. I studied maps, not the cosmic ones, but old-fashioned road atlases I bought at a gas station. I traced routes, looking for paths that avoided major cities, federal highways, and anything that looked like a trap. I found a small insulated cooler to keep my water and jerky fresh. I learned about the Appalachian Trail, about the vast, sprawling national forests, and about the kind of isolation they offered. I was trading one kind of wilderness for another, and this one promised to be even more challenging. The object, my silent companion, continued to pulse with its soft green light in the privacy of the motel room. Sometimes, when I held it, I felt that rush of information again, fragmented images of what looked like ancient, crystalline cities, beings of pure light, and a sense of profound, tranquil sorrow. It was the echo of a dying civilization whispering its last secrets to a rough-handed man in a cheap motel. On the third morning, I walked out of the motel. I left the burner phone in the room, no digital footprint, just me, my backpack, and the object. I walked to the edge of the city to an on-ramp for I-15 North, away from the glittering neon, towards the anonymous ribbon of concrete heading east. My thumb went out. The first few hours were brutal. Cars sped past, their drivers ignoring the weary figure on the shoulder. My fear tried to creep back in, whispering doubts in my ear. "You're crazy, Ray. You're gonna get caught. You're gonna die out here." But then I thought of the pulsing light, the dying cry of another cosmic seed. I thought of the alien janitors patiently waiting for me to make a mistake. I thought of what I had seen, what I now carried. I couldn't give up. Finally, a beat-up pickup truck, its bed filled with empty toolboxes, pulled over. The driver, a weathered old man with a kind face, looked me over. "Where you headed, son?" he asked. "East," I said, my voice raspy. "As far as you're going." He nodded, opened the passenger door, and I climbed in. The truck smelled of stale tobacco and honest hard work. It was a familiar, comforting smell, a scent from my old life. I settled back into the worn seat, placing my backpack carefully on my lap, making sure the object inside was cushioned. As the pickup truck merged onto the highway, leaving the neon glow of Las Vegas behind, I looked out at the vast American landscape stretching before me. The endless roads, the distant mountains, the wide open skies. This country, once so familiar, was now a map of unknown dangers and impossible quests. I was no longer just a trucker. I was a guardian of secrets, a reluctant hero, and a man on the run, carrying a piece of the universe that pulsed with the heartbeat of a forgotten civilization. My journey had just begun. The night haul was over, but the road ahead, the true journey, was just starting. And I had the terrifying, exhilarating feeling that I was exactly where I was meant to be.